Picture this: a map that doesn't whisper of ink, stained parchment, or faded lines drawn by scribes, but one carved from something far more haunting: the bones of fallen warriors, arranged with eerie precision, their silent forms tracing borders between kingdoms torn apart by war. This wasn't just some grim relic tucked away in a dusty tomb. It was a tool of power, a macabre masterpiece that held the fate of 3 warring realms in its skeletal grasp. How could something so chilling become the key to peace, or perhaps to even greater bloodshed? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. A story where history and legend collide in the most unexpected way. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit crypt, the air thick with the weight of centuries, where a group of weary diplomats and battle-hardened lords gather around this bone-strewn tableau. These weren't just lines on a map, they were the remains of those who had fought and died for the very lands now being contested. The message was clear: every border, every disputed mile was paid for in blood. But why bones? Why not gold or treaties or the usual symbols of power? Because in the medieval world, superstition and symbolism held sway over kings and commoners alike. The dead, it was believed, carried a truth the living could not ignore, a truth that could force even the proudest rulers to pause. This isn't just a tale of war and territory, it's a story about the strange, often unsettling ways humans have sought to end conflict. From the whispered negotiations in shadowed halls to the unshakable belief that the bones themselves held a kind of grim wisdom, every twist in this saga reveals how deeply fear, reverence, and desperation shaped the fate of nations. By the time we're done, you'll see how a map made of bones didn't just redefine borders, it rewrote the rules of diplomacy itself. So stay with us, because what unfolds is more than history. It's a journey into the heart of how power, superstition, and the echoes of the past can change the course of empires. For generations, the kingdoms of Almaria, Vorthain, and Serindor tore at each other's throats like wolves, fighting over the same scrap of meat. Almaria's legendary horsemen could sweep across the open plains in a storm of dust and steel, but their strength meant little against Vorthain's towering stone fortresses, each city a bristling hedgehog of walls and watchtowers. And then there was Serindor, whose sleek warships ruled the coastal waters, choking off trade and raining fire on anyone who dared challenge their dominion. 3 powers, each unbeatable in their own way, yet locked in a stalemate that drained their people dry. The heart of their conflict wasn't just pride or old grudges, it was the land itself. A stretch of lush river valleys and bustling ports lay tangled in their borders, claimed by all 3 crowns. With every harvest season, armies marched, burned, and retreated, leaving fields salted and villages smoldering. Borders shifted like sand in the wind, redrawn in blood one year only to blur again the next. By the time the bone map emerged, whole generations had known nothing but war. Fathers buried sons, mothers mourned daughters, and still the kings sent more to die until something shifted. Deep in the hills of Vorthain, a discovery was made. Not gold, not some lost weapon, but a burial site older than the kingdoms themselves. The dead here weren't just skeletons, they were arranged deliberately, their bones forming lines that eerily mirrored the contested borders. Some say it was a priest who first saw the pattern. Others whisper it was a grieving soldier who noticed how the ancient remains seemed to trace boundaries no living map could agree upon. But one thing was certain: this was no accident. The dead had drawn a map long before the living thought to fight over it, and that's when the unthinkable happened. The kings, who had spent lifetimes ignoring the pleas of their people, found themselves staring at this grisly tableau, and for the first time they hesitated. Maybe it was superstition, maybe exhaustion, or maybe even a flicker of shame, but in those bones they saw something no treaty had ever shown them, a line even they dared not cross. The ruined monastery clung to the cliffs like a crumbling sentinel, its broken arches whispering of a time when faith and knowledge intertwined. It was here, beneath layers of dust and forgotten prayers, that the monks found it, not some glittering relic or holy text, but a tableau of bones laid out with unsettling precision. At first glance, it seemed like the aftermath of a massacre, the remains haphazardly piled. But as the torchlight flickered across the fragments, the truth became undeniable. These weren't scattered skeletons, they were arranged into something far more deliberate. Ribs formed mountain ranges, finger bones traced rivers, and skulls marked the sites of long-lost fortresses. And etched into each bone, faint but unmistakable, were runes that hummed with old magic. What began as a grim curiosity soon became a revelation. The map didn't just depict land, it mirrored the very territories the three kingdoms had bled over for generations. The monks, versed in the histories of war, felt a chill as they realized these bones predated the current conflicts by centuries. Someone, long before the first kings of Almaria or Vorthain ever drew breath, had mapped the land with the dead. But why? The answer lay in the monastery's crumbling scrolls, hidden in a chest sealed with wax and silence. They spoke of the Silent Arbiters, a shadowed order of monks and judges who believed the dead held the only impartial truth. While living rulers squabbled over pride and power, the bones, free from allegiance or ambition, could reveal borders untouched by greed. Their methods were as unsettling as they were ingenious. When villages feuded over farmland, the arbiters would exhume those who had worked the soil for generations, laying out their remains to see where the earth had truly claimed them. For blood-soaked battlefields, they mapped the fallen where they lay, letting the dead decide whose land it truly was. The bone map in the monastery was their masterpiece, a last, desperate attempt to end a cycle of war before it began. But history, as it often does, ignored the warning. The kingdoms rose, the map was buried, and the arbiters vanished into legend until now. As word of the discovery spread, the war-weary saw it as a sign. The bones, they whispered, were the only honest mapmakers left. Even the most hardened generals hesitated to march across lines drawn by the dead. And so, in that dim monastery hall, something extraordinary unfolded. For the first time in living memory, the kings of Almaria, Vorthain, and Serindor stood shoulder to shoulder, not over a treaty of parchment, but a map of ghosts. The runes, once cryptic, now seemed to pulse with a single, unspoken command. Let the dead settle what the living cannot. The Silent Arbiters moved through battlefields like shadows, their hooded figures stooping to gather not weapons or spoils, but bones. To the warring kings of their age, they were equal parts holy men and harbingers, a secretive brotherhood who spoke only in verdicts, never in pleas. Their creed was simple, yet radical. The living could lie, cheat, and distort, but the dead carried an unshakable truth in their remains. Where a king might redraw a border on parchment to suit his pride, the arbiters believed the fallen. Scattered where battles had raged already marked the land's true divisions. Their methods defied the politics of the time. When disputes arose over territory, arbiters would arrive uninvited, exhuming mass graves or collecting skeletons from forgotten skirmishes. Each bone was cleaned, studied, then placed with ritual precision to form sprawling maps on temple floors. Rib cages became mountain ranges, spines snaked like rivers, and clusters of finger bones marked crossroads where armies had clashed. The most chilling detail, these maps often contradicted the boasts of conquering lords. A castle claimed by one kingdom might rest firmly in another's territory when viewed through the lattice of the dead. But the arbiters weren't just cartographers, they were judges. Their scrolls tell of trials held in moonlit crypts, where opposing rulers were made to kneel before bone maps while monks chanted the names of the slain. To defy these divine borders was to risk more than war. It was to invite what the arbiters called the weight of the unquiet dead. Kings who ignored their rulings found their crops blighted, their heirs struck by fever, their armies lost in sudden fogs. Coincidence, perhaps, but in an age where every storm and stillbirth was seen as an omen, even the proudest warlords hesitated to test their wrath. Yet power, as it always does, eroded their influence. As kingdoms grew more centralized, rulers dismissed the arbiters as relics of a superstitious past. Maps of ink and vellum replaced those of bone, drawn by surveyors who obeyed crowns, not corpses. The order faded into obscurity, their last members retreating to remote monasteries to guard their final, unfinished work, the very map that would one day silence 3 warring kingdoms. Their legacy wasn't just in the borders they drew, but in the terrifying idea they left behind, that the land itself remembers where blood was spilled, and that the dead might yet have the final word. The story still haunts the hills and taverns of those war-torn lands, the tale of the cursed accord. Long before the 3 kingdoms found themselves trapped in their endless cycle of bloodshed, the Silent Arbiters had nearly achieved the impossible. They gathered the kings in a hall draped with the banners of the fallen, where a bone map sprawled across a stone slab, its lines pulsing with the weight of centuries. The terms were clear, the dead had spoken, and their verdict would divide the contested lands not by strength or pride, but by the solemn geography of sacrifice. For a fleeting moment, peace seemed within reach. Then, with a single act of defiance, King Aldrich of Vorthain, furious that the bones had granted his rivals fertile valleys, he considered his birthright, seized a torch, and reduced the map to ash. What followed wasn't just war, it was as if the land itself revolted. Crops withered overnight in fields that had fed generations. Wells ran dry, their waters turning brackish as if poisoned by invisible hands. And then came the invaders' hordes from beyond the mountains, drawn not by rumor or ambition, but by whispers of a land abandoned by its own protectors. The people called it the Reckoning, a punishment for scorning the wisdom of the dead. Aldrich's own chroniclers wrote of nightmares that plagued him until his death, visions of skeletal figures kneeling at his bedside, pressing cold fingers into the flesh above his heart. By the time his grandson took the throne, Vorthain's once proud fortresses were crumbling under the weight of starvation and siege. Generations later, when laborers uncovered the monastery's buried bone map, the old stories surged back like a tide. Grandmothers who'd scolded children with tales of the cursed accord fell silent, their warnings suddenly real. Even the most skeptical lords hesitated, their hands hovering over swords as if the air itself might resist them. Because this time no one dared repeat Aldrich's mistake. The lesson had been carved into history. The Arbiter's maps weren't just guides or threats. They were mirrors, reflecting the consequences of ignoring the price already paid in blood. And so, when the kings gathered again, it wasn't just fear of famine or invasion that stilled their tongues. It was the unshakable sense that the bones before them weren't relics but witnesses. And this time they would not be silenced. The runes carved into those bones weren't just markings, they were voices from the grave, whispering secrets across centuries. At first, scholars assumed they were simple prayers or memorials, the kind found on any ancient battlefield. But as linguists painstakingly pieced together their meaning, a far darker truth emerged. Each fragment told the same story in miniature, a place, a date, and a number, not the tally of the victorious but the count of the fallen. Blackwater Ford, Midsummer 792. Stonehill Crossing, Winter 341. The bones didn't just mark territory, they catalogued the price paid for every inch of it. What made these runes unlike any other historical record was their chilling impartiality. Most chronicles of war were written by the survivors, eager to glorify their own side or justify their losses, but these inscriptions showed no allegiance. A Vorthain skull beside a Serindorian rib bore the same stark numerals, as if the dead themselves refused to take sides in the disputes of the living. Even more unsettling, the dates spanned generations, revealing battles long forgotten by court historians but preserved in the marrow of those who'd fought them. This wasn't just a map, it was an indictment, a ledger of futility stretching back further than anyone had dared to remember. The religious invocations woven between the numbers deepened the mystery. Phrases like "as ash returns to earth" and "blood is the ink of borders" suggested the arbiters saw war not as a clash of kings, but as a sacrilege against the land itself. Some scholars believe the runes were meant to be read aloud during negotiations, forcing rulers to hear the names of the dead as they argued over the soil that soaked up their blood. Others argue they were warnings, meant to terrify warmongers with the sheer weight of history. After all, what king could boast of conquest when faced with a tally of lives lost for the same patch of dirt 100 years prior? Yet the most haunting revelation came when historians matched the runes to surviving oral traditions. In remote villages, grandmothers still sang laments for battles absent from any royal chronicle skirmishes, deemed too small or shameful to record. But the bones remembered. A child's verse about the weeping at Willowmere aligned perfectly with a femur etched with Willowmere Marsh, spring 216. The dead had kept score where the living had turned away. By the time the last rune was deciphered, even the most skeptical lords couldn't dismiss their power. The map's message was relentless. Every border they fought over had already been paid for in lives, not once, but over and over. To ignore it wasn't just arrogance, it was to spit on the graves of those who died for the same pointless quarrel. And that, perhaps, was the Silent Arbiters' true stroke of genius. They didn't just draw lines in bone, they forced the living to reckon with the echoes of their own cruelty. When the bone map was unveiled in the torch-lit Great Hall, the air itself seemed to stiffen. Queen Eliara of Almaria, her fingers tracing the curve of a rib marked with ancient runes, was the first to break the silence. "This is no trick of monks," she declared, her voice ringing with the conviction of someone who'd lost 2 brothers to border skirmishes. "The dead have always known what the living refused to see." Her advisors nodded. Almaria's oral histories spoke of ancestors who'd fought and bled across these very valleys. To them, the map wasn't just a relic, it was vindication, proof that their claims were etched into the land long before ink touched parchment. But across the hall, Vorthain's High Chancellor scoffed, his jeweled rings glinting as he waved away the display. "Superstition dressed as wisdom," he sneered. "Shall we let corpses dictate the future of the living?" His faction erupted in agreement, their voices sharp with the confidence of a kingdom that had always trusted stone walls over omens. Yet beneath the bluster there was unease, the kind that comes when men who have built their power on rewritten histories face a record they cannot burn. Then there was Serindor. While the others argued, King Roderick stood motionless, his gaze locked on a cluster of finger bones that marked the very bay where his fleet had sunk a generation of Vorthain ships. The runes there told a different story, one of a cove that had swallowed just as many Serindorian vessels centuries earlier. his hands usually steady as the tides trembled. "The cursed accord," he murmured, invoking the old tale none dared speak aloud. His grandmother had warned him about the price of ignoring the dead's verdict. Now, faced with their silent testimony, the weight of that warning pressed down like a storm cloud. The divide that night reshaped everything. Almaria's villagers, weary of sending sons to die for shifting borders, hailed the map as salvation. Priests hung bone fragments in temple doorways, declaring them sacred. Vorthain scholars, desperate to undermine its power, scrambled to draft counter-maps with ink and seal wax, only to watch those parchments curl and blacken in unexplained fires. And Serindor, their court fractured. Half the nobility saw Roderic's hesitation as weakness. The other half whispered that the bones had spared them from repeating a tragedy older than their bloodlines. What unfolded next wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. Soldiers who'd spent years hating faceless enemies now stood before the remains of those who'd fought the same battles in different armor. Farmers whose fields had been trampled by armies recognized the names etched into ribs, and Fima's ancestors they'd never known shared their fate. The map didn't just redraw borders, it forced three kingdoms to stare into the mirror of their own cycles of violence and ask, how many more bones would it take to fill the gaps they'd carved into history? The bone map's borders defied every expectation. Like a judge delivering verdicts no one had dared to plead for. Almaria, long denied the fertile Lysian Valley due to Vorthain's chokehold on its eastern cliffs, found the skeletal fingers pointing unambiguously in their favor. The runes told why centuries before Vorthain's fortresses rose, the valley floor was littered with Almarian farmers' remains, their bones sown into the soil like seeds. The dead remembered who had first turned the earth there, and the arbiters had listened. Vorthain's lords, initially outraged, fell silent when they traced the map's logic to the Blackfang Pass. For generations, this narrow defile had been Serindor's prize, wrested from Vorthain in a brutal winter campaign. But the bones revealed a grimmer truth. The pass had changed hands 7 times across 3 centuries. Each shift marked by heaps of skeletons buried mid-climb. The final rune, etched into a shattered breastplate, read, "No banner flies here long." By granting Vorthain control, the map wasn't rewarding conquest, it was acknowledging the pass as a slaughterhouse no kingdom could truly own. Most shocking was Serindor's gain, the Isle of Thorns, a barren rock crowned with a crumbling temple. Strategically worthless, yet every Serindorian sailor knew its old name, Last Harbor, where storm-tossed ships had dragged their dead ashore for burial since time beyond memory. The island's cliffs were honeycombed with niches holding thousands of urns, their ashes bearing the same clan marks as Serindor's current fleet captains. The Arbiter's message was clear: this wasn't about territory, but continuity. The island had always been a resting place for those lost at sea. To deny Serindor its guardianship would be to dishonor the very waves that fed them. What stunned observers wasn't just the fairness of these divisions, but their uncanny precision. The borders followed no rivers or ridges as living cartographers preferred, but the eerie contours of ancient massacres. A bend in the Lysian River, awarded to Almaria, aligned perfectly with a burial pit holding victims of a forgotten ambush. The jagged line dividing Vorthain and Serindor's coastal claims mirrored the arc of a tidal surge that had once drowned both armies mid-battle. Even the sacred island's boundaries were drawn not by its shoreline, but by the reach of the funeral pyres that had burned there for centuries. This was the bone map's genius. It exposed the folly of human-drawn borders. Kings measured land in leagues and harvests, but the dead tallied it in sacrifices. A valley wasn't just soil and streams, it was the sum of every life spent claiming it. A mountain pass wasn't stone and snow, but the weight of bodies left to freeze in its shadows. The map forced the living to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their wars weren't fought over land, but over graves, and the dead had already decided who owed what to whom. Yet the map's greatest surprise wasn't geographical, it was psychological. For the first time, all three kingdoms faced borders they couldn't resent. Almaria's claim to the valley felt justified not by force, but by ancestral toil. Vorthain's lords, though stripped of fertile land, clung to the Blackfang Pass with solemn reverence, as if entrusted with a tomb. Even Serindor's rivals conceded the Isle of Thorns, for who would envy the keepers of the drowned? The Arbiters had done what no treaty could. They made loss feel like legacy and compromise like consecration. Religious fervor and whispered superstition clung to the bone map like mist over a battlefield. In an era where every eclipse was a portent and every stillborn calf a curse, the idea that the dead themselves had drawn these borders struck a chord deeper than any royal decree. Village priests, their voices trembling with conviction, declared the map a divine ledger, one that balanced the scales of justice not in gold or grain, but in generations of spilled blood. To ignore it, they warned, wasn't just folly, it was blasphemy. The earth remembers, chanted the monks of Serindor's coastal shrines, their fingers brushing the etched runes. To plow a field sown with bones is to reap the whirlwind. Yet not everyone knelt in reverence. Vorthain's High Chancellor, his robes stitched with sigils of reason, dismissed the map as theater, a macabre puppet show staged by the Arbiters' descendants to shame kings into submission. "Show me one miracle," he demanded, "one provable act of the dead shaping the living world." His faction pointed to the monastery's crumbling walls, arguing that if the old order truly held power, why had they faded into obscurity? Skeptics whispered of clever monks rearranging skeletons under cover of night, of runes carved not centuries ago, but in secret by hands still warm with life. The map, they insisted, was a weapon of psychology, not divinity. This tension between faith and reason fractured every court and council. Almarian peasants left offerings of honey and barley at crossroads where the map's lines intersected, convinced ancestral spirits guarded these thresholds. Meanwhile, Vorthain's scholars pored over crumbling scrolls, desperate to prove the runes were mere tallies of the dead, not divine verdicts. Even nature seemed to take sides. In Serindor, a child's fever broke the moment her mother laid a fragment of the bone map beneath her bed, an event heralded as a sign. Yet that same week, a bolt of lightning struck Vorthain's royal archives, burning every parchment except those criticizing the Arbiters. Coincidence? The faithful saw vindication, the skeptical saw opportunism. The true power of the bone map lay in its ambiguity. It didn't speak with the clarity of scripture or the force of law, but in the hushed language of unearthed grief. When a Vorthain captain, ordered to march his troops across a valley the map had granted to Almaria, found his boots sinking into mud that hadn't been there the day before, his men refused to advance. No priest had cursed them, no monk stood in their path, yet the earth itself seemed to resist. Was it groundwater or ghosts? The question didn't matter, only the effect. Fear, whether divine or imagined, proved mightier than steel. By the time the three kings met to ratify the borders, the debate had shifted. This was no longer about land, but about the stories people told themselves to justify possession. The bone map forced a choice. Was history written by the victors or by the vanquished? Could peace be forged not through strength, but through surrender, to memory, to the weight of the past, to the unsettling idea that the dead might yet hold the living accountable? In the end, even the skeptics hesitated, not because they believed, but because they couldn't risk being wrong. The negotiations began in the dead of night, far from the prying eyes of courts and crowds. A crumbling abbey on the edge of the Whispering Marshes served as neutral ground, its cracked stained glass windows casting fractured light over the stone table where the bone map lay. The emissaries arrived cloaked and wary, each carrying sealed orders from their kings. Almaria's envoy, a silver-haired general with a limp earned at Blackwater Ford, refused to sit until Vorthain's representative, a sharp-tongued chancellor infamous for his poison-tipped quill, relinquished the dagger at his belt. Meanwhile, Serindor's delegate, a ship captain's widow with salt-stained sleeves, placed a rusted compass on the table. "No one steers this meeting off course," she murmured, her gaze lingering on the map's skeletal rivers. What followed wasn't diplomacy, it was theater of the absurd where logic and desperation collided. Vorthain's scholars, sweating in their velvet robes, unfurled scrolls claiming the bones were misaligned, their measurements flawed. One even produced a cadaver smuggled from the royal catacombs, thrusting its femur against the map like a child matching puzzle pieces. Almaria's historian, a woman who'd spent decades studying the Arbiter's scrolls, countered by slamming a rusted helmet onto the table. Its dented surface bore runes identical to those on the skull beneath it. "Deny the dead all you like," she said, her voice quiet as a grave digger's shovel. "But rust doesn't lie." Then came the bribes, chests of gold from Vorthain, their lids thrown open to glint in the torchlight. A deed to Serindor's richest pearl beds, inked on vellum so thin it trembled in the draft. Almaria's offer was subtler, a tiny velvet pouch spilled onto the table, revealing soil from the Lycian Valley. Not just any soil, but earth scraped from the roots of an ancient oak where Almarian farmers had hanged their own children, rather than let them starve under Vorthain's siege. The message was clear: some sacrifices couldn't be bought. The duel erupted over a single rib bone. Vorthain's youngest scholar, a prodigy with a temper, swore the runes upon it were forged, until Serindor's aged linguist, her fingers knotted with arthritis, traced the markings and recited the names of the fallen from memory. The scholar's gauntlet hit the floor before anyone could intervene. They fought not with swords, but with quills dipped in acid ink, each stroke etching arguments onto parchment to be judged by the abbey's blind prior. By dawn, the scholar knelt in the ashes of his own burned treatise, his once proud voice reduced to a whisper: "The dead have better lawyers," and then the fire. It started in the scriptorium, where the map's lone copy had been hidden under guard. Flames chewed through the door before the alarm was raised, leaving only a twisted frame of blackened bone and a stench like molten lead. Sabotage: Vorthain's guards were seen fleeing the abbey that night. Supernatural: a novice swore she'd glimpsed a skeletal hand retreating into the smoke. The truth died with the embers, but the consequence was undeniable. With the copy destroyed, the original bone map became the only authority left. No more debates, no more revisions. The dead, it seemed, had grown tired of being questioned. When the envoys finally staggered into daylight, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion, even the most stubborn among them hesitated to touch the map's remains. Something had shifted in that smoke-choked hall, not fear, but the dawning realization that they weren't just negotiating with each other. Every offer, every threat, every desperate plea had been witnessed by the bones themselves. And bones, unlike kings, never forget. The first riots erupted not in the slums or farmlands, but in the marble halls of Vorthain's grand cathedral. When a deacon's drunken servant leaked word that the bone map had assigned the sacred hill of ashes to Serindor, nobles tore down tapestries with their bare hands. "Blasphemy!" roared a duke whose family had donated half the cathedral's gold only for a blacksmith's widow to shout back. What's more blasphemous, losing land or losing more sons? By dawn, the hill itself became a battleground, peasants and priests alike digging frantically in the soil. Some sought proof the arbiters were wrong. others prayed to unearth bones that would silence the doubters. What they found was worse than anyone expected: a charred layer of children's teeth, remnants of a massacre even the holy texts had erased. News spread like wildfire through a drought-stricken field. In Almaria, farmers knelt in the very valleys the map had granted them, pressing their foreheads to earth that still held arrowheads from their grandfather's last stand. "The bones remember us," murmured an old ploughman, his calloused fingers brushing a femur fragment jutting from the mud. But in the capital, lords who'd grown fat off war taxes called it peasant madness. One baron famously threw a bone map replica into his banquet's fireplace, only for the flames to spit it back out unscathed. A trick of treated parchment, his alchemist swore, though the kitchen boys crossed themselves and fled. Serindor's unrest took a darker turn. When fishermen learned the Isle of Thorns, long considered cursed, was now theirs, they hung skulls from their nets as talismans against vengeful spirits. Their queen, torn between triumph and terror, ordered the island's cliffs searched for more bones. What her scouts found wasn't just Serindorian dead, but ships' figureheads from a dozen nations, all pointing inward as if the island itself had been drawing souls home for centuries. The revelation split her court like a cracked mast. "This isn't a gift," hissed her admiral, "it's a burial detail." Yet the dockworkers, who'd spent generations retrieving drowned sailors for pennies, wept at the discovery. Finally, someone had counted their lost. In the chaos, 3 movements crystallized. The bone-bound, mostly peasants and veterans, wore fragments of the map as amulets and refused to fight old enemies. The Ashbloods, nobles and merchants, denounced the map as a fraud and hired mercenaries to reclaim disputed lands. And then there were the Arbiters' Shadow, a secretive cotter of monks and deserters who vanished into the night, returning at dawn with freshly exhumed skeletons laid precisely along contested borders. Their leader, a disgraced court cartographer, left notes written in charcoal on castle gates. "You argue over lines, we draw with what filled the ditches beneath them." The breaking point came when Vorthain's king, pressured by his lords to reject the map, awoke to find his throne room carpeted with bones, not arranged as a threat but as a question, each cluster marking a battle where his ancestors had fallen. The message was undeniable. The same land they called their birthright had claimed generation after generation of their blood. That night, he walked alone to the Hill of Ashes with a shovel. By sunrise, his blistered hands had unearthed what the rioters missed: a child's skeleton curled around a toy soldier, its tiny fist still clutching a standard no living army carried. When he lifted it, the fabric disintegrated, revealing a truth far heavier than any crown. The dead outnumbered the living, and their patience was running out. Medieval maps were less about geography and more about storytelling, grand tapestries of ink and vellum where dragons lurked at the edges and Jerusalem sat squarely at the center of the world. Kings commissioned them as displays of power, monks drew them as acts of devotion, and merchants used them as rough guides peppered with warnings about bandits and sea monsters. What these maps rarely showed were borders as we understand them today. A kingdom might be represented by a crowned lion or a walled city, its territories implied rather than measured. Rivers bent to fit the page, mountains loomed larger to signify importance, and distances shrank or stretched based on who held the quill. These weren't navigational tools so much as declarations. This is how we wish the world to be. The Silent Arbiters' bone map defied every convention. Where a royal cartographer might sketch a forest as a cluster of stylized trees, the Arbiters used the vertebrae of hunters who'd vanished in its depths. A cathedral city, typically marked by a gleaming spire on parchment, appeared on their map as a ring of skulls, the laborers who'd died building it. Most radical of all was their rejection of the medieval mapmaker's greatest liberty, the ability to erase. Traditional maps airbrushed away inconvenient truths, mass graves, failed campaigns, lands lost to rivals, but the Arbiters forced every conflict, every sacrifice back into view. Their work wasn't just a chart, it was an accusation. Consider the famed Mappa Mundi of Hereford, a 13th century masterpiece crammed with biblical scenes and mythical beasts. Its depiction of Britain is so distorted that Scotland appears as a mere bump, while the continent sprawls in dreamlike detail. Yet to its creators, accuracy mattered less than moral instruction. The map was a sermon in pigment. Now imagine those same monks confronted with the bone map's brutal honesty. Where their parchment showed Eden, the Arbiters might place the rib cage of a child who'd starved during a siege. Where they drew the Tower of Babel, the bones would spell out how many had died quarrying its stones. The contrast couldn't be starker. One map offered comfort in divine order, the other forced viewers to reckon with the human cost of that order's upkeep. Even so-called practical maps of the era served agendas. Portolan charts used by sailors meticulously traced coastlines but often exaggerated the wealth of trading partners or the hazards near rivals' ports. A Genos map might depict Venice's harbor as unnavigable, while Venetian cartographers forgot to mark Genoa's lucrative silk roads. The bone map tolerated no such lies. Its runes recorded not only who died where, but why. A Serindorian sailor's femur etched with the name of the storm that drowned him, a Vorthain arrowhead fused to an Almarian shield bearing the date of a truce broken at dawn. Where ink and vellum maps allowed kings to cherry-pick history, the Arbiters presented an unbroken chain of consequence. Perhaps their most subversive act was reclaiming scale. Medieval mapmakers routinely shrank undesirable lands, marshes, tundras, territories of lesser peoples to insignificance. The bone map reversed this arrogance. A swamp might dominate an entire section because thousands had perished draining it. A barren hillock, overlooked in royal atlases, sprawled large in bones. Its strategic value in forgotten wars made it a pivot point for the dead. This wasn't cartography as flattery or faith, but as forensic accounting. Every inch of ground carried a receipt written in marrow. Yet for all its grim precision, the bone map shared one trait with its ornamental cousins. It demanded interpretation. A king viewing the Mappa Mundi saw God's plan. A merchant saw trade winds. A crusader saw paths to glory. Likewise, the bones spoke differently to each observer. To a grieving mother, they were memorials. To a general, they were tactical warnings. To the Arbiters themselves, they formed a ledger of debts unpaid. And therein lay their ultimate power. They forced the living to confront not just the land's past, but their own place in its unending story. Where traditional maps asked, "What do you own?" the bone map whispered, "What do you owe?" Not every scholar bowed to the bone map's eerie authority. In the hushed halls of Vorthain's Royal Academy, a wiry archivist named Master Tovel spent months hunched over fragments, his magnifying glass catching the light as he hunted for flaws. Fraud, he declared, tapping a rib bone with ink-stained fingers. "Look here, the runes on this edge are sharper, less weathered. Someone added them later." His theory spread like smoke. The map wasn't some ancient oracle, but a desperate gambit by monks centuries after the Arbiter's extinction. Perhaps, he argued, they'd rearranged old battlefield remains to shame warring kings into truce. After all, history was full of pious deceptions, relics miraculously discovered when coffers ran dry, visions conveniently aligning with political needs. The skeptic's case wasn't without merit. Scrolls from the monastery's own library contradicted parts of the bone map's narrative. One parchment, penned by a traveling herbalist, described the Lysian Valley as Vorthain's Duel, decades before the bones supposedly proved it Almarian. Even the runes themselves raised eyebrows, their dialect shifted subtly between clusters, as if multiple hands had carved them over generations. A forgery doesn't need to be flawless, scoffed a Serindorian naval historian. It just needs to be terrifying enough to work. Then came the carbon dating, when a fragment from the map's central skull was tested alongside bones from a documented 7th century massacre. The results silenced even the loudest doubters. Both samples matched. Not only were the bones ancient, but their arrangements predated the earliest known records of the Arbiters. Toval, ever the contrarian, clung to his theory. Age proves nothing, he snapped. A clever forger would use old bones, yet his voice wavered when linguists discovered something chilling. The inconsistent runes weren't errors but layers. Like a palimpsest of violence, they recorded conflicts across centuries. Each war's dead added to the last. The deeper scholars dug, the stranger the evidence grew. A femur etched with a battle from King Aldrich's reign bore tool marks made by a blade not forged until 200 years later. At first, this seemed proof of tampering until metallurgists realized the anachronistic marks were repairs. Someone had preserved the bone map across generations, maintaining its grim ledger long after the Arbiters vanished. This wasn't a forgery, it was an inheritance. By the time Toval lay on his deathbed, even he admitted the truth, not in words but in the way his fingers traced the replica map beside him, lingering over the runes for mercy. The bone map's power never relied on magic or miracles. Its genius was simpler and far more haunting. It forced the living to stand knee-deep in the consequences of their ancestors' pride and ask how much deeper did they want the ditches dug. The child's name was Lyra, a fisherman's daughter from Serindor's eastern coast who had never seen a map in her life. When fever gripped her for 7 nights, her family assumed it was the damp curse that took so many in the marsh villages. But what poured from her lips when the fever broke wasn't delirium. It was a litany of names, dates, and landscapes no 6-year-old could have known. She described valleys where Almarian cavalry had drowned in hidden bogs, their bones still tangled in the roots. She wept for Vorthain soldiers who'd frozen solid in a pass now marked by the Arbiter's ribcage border. Most chillingly, she drew lines in the ashes of the hearth that matched the bone map's contours exactly, her small fingers trembling as if guided by unseen hands. Word spread faster than plague. Within days, pilgrims clogged the muddy roads to Lyra's hut, begging her to speak their lost kin's names. A Vorthain spy disguised as a tanner brought back a lock of the girl's hair to his masters, only for their court alchemist to drop it like hot iron. "This isn't trickery," he whispered, showing them how the strands curled into perfect rune shapes when dipped in holy water. Meanwhile, Serindor's high priestess demanded proof, grilling Lyra about obscure battles from centuries past. The child answered in a voice far older than her years, recounting not just the wars, but the songs sung by doomed sentries the night before slaughter. When pressed, she traced the priestess' own lineage back to a captain who'd abandoned his post to save his men, a shameful secret buried in family crypts. Skeptics scrambled for explanations. Maybe Lyra had overheard monks discussing the map during her fever. Perhaps she'd touched a bone fragment washed ashore after some storm. But the details defied logic. She knew the exact number of stitches in a standard Almarian saddle blanket from 200 years prior, a fact only Armorers' Guild records confirmed. She hummed a marching song from a Vorthain regiment disbanded before her great-grandparents were born, and when a scholar tried to trip her up with a false date, she recoiled as if struck. "Lies taste like rust," she murmured, her pupils dilating unnaturally in the firelight. The kingdom's reactions were as varied as their banners. Almarian peasants began leaving dolls made of woven grass at the bone map's marked borders, offerings to the Little Seer. Vorthain's council erupted into factions, some calling for the girl's immediate execution as a witch, others secretly sending envoys with gifts of silver bells to hang at her door. But it was Serindor's queen who made the decisive move. She arrived unannounced at Lyra's hut with no guards, no crown, just a dagger and a question. If we honor these borders for 1 year, what happens? The child, busy stacking oyster shells into a miniature fortress, didn't look up. The earth stops drinking, she said simply, for a while. That night, under a moon stained red by distant wildfires, the three kings signed what later chroniclers would call the Ash Accord. Not a permanent treaty, but a trial 12 moons of peace along the bone map's lines. They thought they were buying time. What they didn't realize was that the land itself had been keeping score. That first morning, shepherds across the disputed valleys swore their flocks moved differently, no longer shying from old battle scars in the soil, as if some invisible fence had lifted. And in the capital squares where criers announced the truce, the crowds fell silent, not in celebration, but in the eerie certainty that they were being watched not by kings or soldiers, but by the countless unblinking eyes beneath their feet. Implementing the borders carved in bone was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands, technically possible, but messy as hell. Take the village of Brighthillow, nestled in the crook of the Lysian Valley for 12 generations. One morning, they were Almarian subjects singing harvest hymns. By dusk, Vorthain's black and gold banners snapped over their granary while grim-faced soldiers counted heads like livestock. The Arbiter's map had spoken their ancestral fields now belonged to a kingdom whose language they barely understood. Old man Herrick, who'd lost 3 sons defending those same fields, took one look at the bone fragment the captain carried and spat. "My boys died for this dirt," he growled, gripping his scythe. "You telling me their bones don't count?" The standoff lasted 3 days before someone set fire to the courthouse records. Trade routes unraveled overnight. The Silk Pass, a vital artery where Almarian wool met Serindorian spices, now zigzagged across 2 new borders. Merchants who'd bribed the same customs officers for decades found themselves shackled in irons for lacking freshly stamped permits. A caravan master famously bribed guards with his entire cargo of saffron, only to discover the next checkpoint belonged to a rival lord who preferred his bribes in silver. "The dead don't care about your schedules," sneered a Vorthain tax collector, pocketing yet another bribe as oxen lowed in protest. Meanwhile, the protests grew uglier. In Serindor's capital, a mob hung effigies of the Arbiters from the city gates, their straw limbs stuffed with sheep bones. "Our laws come from the living," chanted students, their faces smeared with ash. Yet just outside the walls, a group of widows knelt in a freshly plowed field, pressing bone shards into the soil like seeds. "The dead kept better books," muttered one, her fingers tracing runes older than her great-grandmother's prayers. The illusion of stability became its own currency. When Vorthain's mint-struck coins stamped with a skeletal border, a grinning skull where the king's profile should be, black markets sprouted within hours. Peasants traded ghost pennies under tavern tables, convinced the dead would bring luck or vengeance. A Serindorian admiral ordered to burn a smuggler's ship caught crossing the new maritime boundary, instead let the crew swim ashore. "I won't drown men over lines drawn by corpses," he told his shocked lieutenants, tossing the bone map into the sea. It washed up 3 days later in a fishing net, pristine. What kept the peace wasn't law, but theater. Every full moon, the 3 kingdoms staged joint patrols along the bone borders. Soldiers from rival armies marching shoulder to shoulder, their commanders exchanging stiff bows over trenches filled with replica skeletons. The crowds loved it. Children waved little bone flags, minstrels sang ballads about the ghost roads, but the real work happened in the shadows. A Vorthain general secretly ordered his men to bury disputed casualties along the new lines, reinforcing the Arbiter's verdict. Almarian priests slipped bone fragments into the foundations of rebuilt bridges, whispering blessings. Even the protesters played their part. Their rage gave rulers an excuse to pardon deserters, to commute sentences, to blame the chaos on the dead rather than the living. By the time winter froze the battlefields into silence, something unexpected had taken root. Not obedience, not even true belief, but the grudging understanding that the bone map wasn't just a set of borders. It was a mirror, forcing each kingdom to stare into the hollow eyes of its own history and ask, how many more bones would it take to fill the cracks in their pride? The redrawn borders didn't just shift lines on parchment, they yanked the very lifeblood from economies built over generations. Take Almaria's famed Silver Vein, a labyrinth of mines that had bankrolled their cavalry for centuries. Overnight, the bone map placed it squarely in Vorthain's grasp, leaving Almarian coiners staring at empty furnaces. The shockwaves were immediate. Armorers hiked prices, merchants hoarded coins, and the kingdom's legendary horse markets where steeds were traditionally paid for in freshly minted silver, ground to a standstill. Desperate traders resorted to bartering weapons for sacks of grain, while Vorthain's mint masters, drowning in unexpected wealth, made a show of stamping their new coins with Almarian stallions, a taunt that sparked riots in border towns. Yet for every kingdom strangling on loss, another gulped unexpected fortune. Vorthain's windfall wasn't just metallic. The bone map granted them the Golden Bowl, a stretch of Almarian farmland so fertile, locals swore seeds sprouted before they hit the soil. Within months, Vorthain's storehouses bulged with wheat, their bakers boasting loaves fluffed with enemy dirt. But abundance bred its own chaos. Flooding the market with cheap grain bankrupted their own farmers, who took to uprooting boundary stones under cover of night. Meanwhile, Almarian refugees, once proud growers of that same wheat, now sneaked across the border to work as day laborers, their calloused hands harvesting crops that had fed their families for generations. Serindor's gains were less tangible but no less transformative. Control of the Isle of Thorns turned the barren rock into a pilgrimage magnet. Fishermen who'd once cursed its treacherous currents now ferried weeping devotees to its cliffs, selling vials of holy brine scooped from tidal pools where ancestors' ashes had mingled with the sea. Innkeepers built rickety hostels along the coast, their walls papered with sketches of the bone map's runes as if they were sacred verses. Even the island's infamous bone storms, gusts that occasionally hurled ancient fragments onto nearby beaches, became a macabre tourist draw. Parents whispered that these flying relics never struck children, a superstition that had crowds of hopeful families combing the shore after every squall. The strangest twist, some industries thrived precisely because of the disruption. Blacksmiths along the new borders did a roaring trade in peace nails, forged from melted-down swords and stamped with skeletal motifs. Enterprising scribes sold border deeds that blended the Arbiter's runes with modern property lines, a legal heresy that somehow held up in courts desperate for compromise. Even the grudges themselves became currency. A Serindorian brewer trademarked Truce Ale, brewed with yeast scraped from bones in the disputed valleys. His slogan, the drink that outlasts kingdoms, but beneath the opportunism simmered a deeper truth. These economies weren't just adapting, they were metabolizing the map's grim logic. A Vorthain tax collector auditing a village now split by the bone-drawn line famously quipped, "You can tax the living, but how do you assess a field that's technically a graveyard?" His solution, a resting fee paid not to the crown but to a fund maintaining the mass graves beneath the furrows. Farmers grumbled but paid not out of fear of the king, but of the dead whose names they'd begun murmuring at planting time. The lesson was clear. Even in ledgers, the bones had the final word. The bone map didn't just reshape borders, it seeped into the marrow of everyday life, weaving itself into songs, stories, and the very way people made sense of their world. In taverns from Almaria's plains to Serindor's fog-drenched ports, bards strummed lutes and spun ballads about the Silent Arbiters, their voices dropping to whispers when recounting how the dead had outsmarted the living. One particularly catchy tune, The Skeleton's Bargain, became so popular that street performers adapted it into a raucous drinking game. Take a swig every time the lyrics mentioned a border, and you'd be under the table by the second verse. But beneath the laughter there was unease. These weren't just songs, they were lessons dressed in melody, reminders that the ground beneath your feet might remember more than you did. Artists, too, couldn't resist the map's macabre allure. In Vorthain's grand theaters, actors donned skeletal masks to play the arbiters in morality plays, their hollow-eyed visages looming over kings like vengeful ghosts. The most famous, The Judgment of Ribs, ended with a child played by a doll stuffed with actual sheep bones placing a tiny hand on a prop map and declaring, "You argue over dirt, but the dirt is made of us." Audiences left in stunned silence, some crossing themselves, others pocketing fragments of the shattered props as charms. Even stained glass artisans got in on the act, replacing saints and angels in chapel windows with intricate mosaics of bone borders, sunlight bleeding through the gaps like old wounds reopening. Then came the children's tales, what started as a way to spook unruly youngsters, finish your porridge, or the bone men will mark your bed their territory. Morphed into something stranger, kids began playing a game called Runes and Remains, scratching symbols onto stones and hiding them in each other's pockets as curses. Teachers complained of pupils drawing skeletal maps on their slates instead of sums, their childish scrawls eerily accurate to the contested valleys. And in one remote village, a group of girls dug up a fox skeleton and arranged it into a tiny replica of the Lysian border, giggling until their mothers found them and fell to their knees in prayer. The message was clear. The next generation wasn't just learning about the bone map, they were internalizing it, treating the dead not as relics, but as referees in their own petty disputes. Yet folklore cuts both ways. For every ballad glorifying the arbiter's wisdom, there was a cautionary fable warning of their cruelty. In Serindor's coastal hamlets, fishermen told of a greedy lord who mocked the bone map, only to wake the next morning with his bedsheets crawling with centipedes that spelled out the word thief in archaic runes. Almarian shepherds swore that straying flocks who crossed the new borders would return with wool tinged rust red, as if brushed against something still bleeding underground. Even the map's supporters couldn't resist embellishing. A popular rumor claimed that anyone who slept with a bone fragment under their pillow would dream of their own ancestors' deaths, a Defies oracle that sent demand for authentic relics skyrocketing in black markets. The most fascinating shift, though, was in how people began interpreting justice itself. Courts in border towns started displaying bone map replicas beside their judgment benches, not as evidence but as silent witnesses. A petty thief might get a lighter sentence if his crime occurred near a rune-marked mass grave. The dead have suffered enough here, a magistrate might sigh. Conversely, a nobleman caught poaching deer in a grove the map designated as resting ground could find himself buried up to his neck in the very soil he'd trespassed upon, his headstone a recycled femur. The lines between law, superstition, and performance blurred until no one could say where one ended and the next began. and perhaps that was the bone map's true legacy. It didn't just change borders, it changed how people saw time itself. The past wasn't a locked chest of fading records, it was an active participant, its bones nudging the present toward reckonings long overdue. A farmer ploughing his field might pause to pocket a tooth fragment turned up by the plough, knowing his grandfather's bones lay somewhere beneath the furrows. A merchant haggling over silk prices might suddenly concede, haunted by the thought that his great-great-uncle had died mid-barter in this very square. The arbiters had vanished, but their work endured in the quiet moments when the living hesitated, glancing over their shoulders at the unseen jury of the dead. The Baron's name was Edrick of Blackfen, a bear of a man with a voice like grinding stone and a temper to match. When the bone map stripped his family's ancestral holdings, a stretch of Almarian riverlands his great-grandfather had seized in a midnight raid, he didn't just protest. He burned the decree in the town square, scattering the ashes over a pit of slaughtered pigs. Let the dead eat their own lies, he roared, and 500 armed men cheered him on. His rebellion wasn't some petty border skirmish, it was a spectacle. He rode into disputed villages with a wagon load of Vorthain soil, dumping it at the feet of confused farmers. "There's your new border," he'd sneer, kicking dirt onto their threshold. His followers, a mix of dispossessed knights and opportunists, wore badges of broken bones crossed with swords, a mockery of the arbiter's solemnity. For months, Edrick's raids carved a bloody gash through the fragile peace. Almarian patrols found their own scouts strung up from oak trees, ribcages cracked open to mimic the map's runes. Worse, his rhetoric struck a chord far beyond his lands. In taverns from Vorthain's capital to Serindor's docks, men whispered that the bone map was a scam, a puppet show staged by cowards afraid to fight. Even some who'd lost kin in the wars grumbled that honoring the dead shouldn't mean surrendering to them. Edrick's revolt became a rallying cry for everyone who'd ever resented being told where to kneel. Then came the Feast of the Hollow Crown, a minor holiday Edrick turned into a drunken spectacle. He hosted a banquet in a reclaimed Almarian outpost, serving roast boar on plates made from salvaged armor. Halfway through his victory speech, he clutched his throat not in pain but in confusion. Witnesses swore his fingers pried at something only he could see, as if plucking at invisible threads. By the time his physician arrived, Edrick was dead, his face frozen in an expression not of agony but astonishment. The official record called it a burst vessel in the brain. His followers called it the Curse's Hand, pointing to the bone fragment someone had slipped into his wine goblet, a sliver from the Lysian Valley itself, etched with a single word, enough. The effect was instant. Raiders who'd spent weeks pillaging in Edrick's name melted back into the forests, their broken bone badges tossed into creeks. A Serindorian privateer who'd been funding the rebellion abruptly retired to a monastery, claiming he'd dreamed of his drowned crewmates standing knee-deep in a field of marrow. Even Edrick's family, initially vowing vengeance, quietly interred him not in the ancestral crypt, but in a patch of disputed land, just over the bone map's line, as if even in death they dared not cross it. But here's the twist: the curse wasn't what truly ended the resistance. It was the silence afterward. No triumphant sermons from the Arbiter's heirs, no gloating from the kings. Just the wind through the Lysian reeds, sounding unnervingly like a sigh. That absence of spectacle left room for doubt to fester. Had Edrick been struck down by divine wrath, or by a clever poisoner exploiting the legend? The unanswered question did more to enforce the borders than any army could. Men who'd laughed at bone maps now hesitated before stepping on a crack in the road, half convinced the earth beneath might remember their disrespect. And so the rebellion didn't end with a battle cry. but with a collective shiver, the dawning realization that in this new world, even Defiance had to answer to the dead. The final days of the trial year crept in like a thief, frost etching skeletal patterns on castle windows as the three kingdoms held their breath. Every tavern, every council chamber, every soldier's firelit watchpost hummed with the same question: would the bone map's borders become permanent, or would the land once more drown in the old, familiar bloodshed? The answer came not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet tally of mundane miracles. For the first time in living memory, Almarian shepherds drove their flocks through Blackfang Pass without armed escort. Vorthain's tax collectors crossed the Lysian Valley without hiding their sigils. Serindor's fishermen hauled nets alongside former enemies, their laughter carrying over waves that had once borne warships. Yet the true testament to the map's power lay in the absences: no midnight raids torching harvests, no mothers keening over sons sent to die for some lord's pride. Even the bandits seemed chastened. One notorious highwayman was caught with a bone fragment strung around his neck, muttering that the dead marked good hunting grounds. The numbers didn't lie. Border skirmishes had plummeted by 70%, trade routes flourished, and for once, the winter's death toll came from blizzards, not blades. Still, old hatreds don't vanish like morning mist. Vorthain's merchants grumbled about lost tariffs, their coffers lighter without Lysian grain taxes. Almarian bards composed epic laments for the stolen silver vein, their dirges selling better than victory songs. And in Serindor's navy halls, admirals glared at charts where the Isle of Thorns now flew their flag but felt like borrowed plunder. The bone map had brought peace, but not pride, and kings feed on pride as surely as crows on carrion. The moment of reckoning came not in a throne room, but a sheep pasture. The three monarchs met on neutral ground, a muddy hillock the map had deemed no king's land, its soil churned by generations of clashing boots. No banners flew, no scribes recorded their words. What passed between them was part confession, part concession. Almaria's queen spoke of villages no longer emptying at the first rumor of war. Vorthain's king admitted his arsenals were gathering dust instead of corpses. Serindor's aging ruler, his hands still smelling of salt and ship tar, simply held up a child's wooden toy, a crude carving of the bone map worn smooth by tiny fingers. "They're learning a different world," he said. That night, under a sky streaked with the last winter stars, the Accord of Ash became the Pact of Marrow. Not a surrender, not a victory, but a ledger balanced in bones. The borders would stand, not because the kings believed in ghosts, but because they'd glimpsed the alternative, a future where the ditches never stopped filling, where every inch of soil demanded its price in flesh. The dead had drawn their lines. The living, at last, had learned to step lightly. Long after the last kings who signed the Pact of Marrow crumbled to dust in their own tombs, the bone map's borders held, not as temporary truce lines, but as the unshakable foundation of an entire continent's identity. Generations grew up learning these boundaries in schoolrooms, not as lines drawn by conquerors, but as echoes of a verdict handed down by the dead. Treaties referenced them with eerie reverence, scribes adding clauses like, "as ordained by the Silent Arbiters reckoning," alongside royal seals. Even wars between new dynasties somehow skirted these ancient divisions, as if the soil itself resisted violation. A Vorthain general during the Great Coastal Wars famously refused to march his troops through a valley the map had marked as Almarian, despite it being the shortest route to victory. When pressed, he simply said, "The bones there sleep lightly." His men, many of whom had grandparents who'd lived through the Accord of Ash, needed no further explanation. Modern scholars still pick apart the bone map's legacy with equal parts fascination and skepticism. Dr. Ilara Venz, a leading medieval historian, argues it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, a bluff so audacious even the bluffer started believing it. Her research points to the Arbiter's cunning use of pre-existing burial sites, arranged to exploit known battle trauma in the collective memory. They didn't invent grief, she writes, they weaponized it. Yet her colleague, Professor Dane Felcrest, counters with carbon-dated evidence showing some bone clusters predated the Arbiters by centuries. This wasn't manipulation, he insists, it was archaeology as diplomacy. The Arbiters didn't create the map, they uncovered it, like a sword buried in a riverbed still sharp. The deeper question isn't whether the map worked, but why, and what that reveals about power itself. In a world where kings justified rule through divine right or brute force, the bone map introduced a third authority, the weight of accumulated suffering. It forced rulers to confront an uncomfortable truth that every border, no matter how proudly drawn, was built atop layers of unmarked graves. A Serindorian philosopher during the Enlightenment era scribbled in his journal, "The Arbiters proved that land isn't owned by those who hold it, but by those who bled for it." The living are just temporary tenants. Yet for all its moral weight, the map's endurance may owe as much to pragmatism as to fear. Merchants adored the stability it brought. Caravans could finally plan routes years in advance without worrying about shifting frontiers. Farmers tilled fields that hadn't been scorched in decades, their children learning to read the rune-marked boundary stones like street signs. Even bandits respected the lines, knowing stolen goods were harder to fence across territories where everyone recognized bone-marked property. The map didn't just prevent wars, it built a framework for ordinary people to trust the ground beneath their feet. Today, hikers in the Lysian Valley still stumble upon weather-worn bone fragments, their runes faded but legible. Local guides warn tourists not to pocket them, they've done their work, the saying goes. Archaeologists debate whether to preserve the sites or let the earth reclaim them. Meanwhile, in the bustling cities that now sprawl across old battlefields, the bone map lives on in subtler ways. Almaria's flag still bears a stylized rib cage along its border. Vorthain's national anthem includes a verse about the unbroken lines of the silent judges, and Serindor's constitution explicitly forbids altering territories settled by ancestral covenant. The dead may not arbitrate the living anymore, but their shadows linger in every law, every custom, every quiet moment when someone glances at a map and wonders who paid for the lines. Perhaps the map's greatest lesson wasn't about borders, but about time. It forced 3 kingdoms to stop seeing land as something to be grabbed and start seeing it as something to be answered to. The Arbiters understood what modern leaders often forget, that every inch of soil comes with a ledger, and the debts aren't to the future, but to the past. Whether genius or fluke, the bone map's real power lay in making that truth impossible to ignore. Centuries later, its silent verdict still whispers, the land remembers even when the living pretend not to. The museum attic smelled of dust and forgotten things, its wooden crates stacked like unmarked graves. That's where Dr. Leora Vex found them in the summer of 2012. A collection of yellowed bones tucked between ceremonial masks and broken pottery, their catalogue entry reading simply, "Ritual objects, origin unknown." But the moment her gloved fingers brushed against the largest fragment, she felt the grooves, not random cracks, but deliberate carvings, lines too precise for time or chance. Under the glare of her desk lamp, the truth emerged. This wasn't some shaman's relic. It was a piece of the bone map missing for centuries. Modern tools peeled back layers of grime and silence. Multispectral imaging revealed inscriptions invisible to the naked eye, names not of kings or battles but of the silent arbiters themselves. Halin of the Vale. Tauren the Unflinching, Veiler who listens. These weren't the shadowy monks of legend. They were individuals, their identities meticulously erased from every historical record. Even stranger, the script varied wildly, some runes etched with the steady hand of a scholar, others jagged as if carved in haste. This wasn't the work of a single generation, but a chain of custodians passing the map down like a cursed inheritance. Then came the carbon dating. The bones spanned 300 years, far longer than any human lifetime. Halin's fragments dated to the early conflicts, Tauren's to the height of the border wars, Veiler's to the brink of the Accord. The implications were staggering. The Arbiters hadn't just documented history, they'd shaped it, adding new casualties to the map with each fresh wave of bloodshed. A pattern emerged in the inscriptions, not random tallies, but targeted placements. The Lysian Valley bones clustered where Almarian cavalry charges were weakest. The Blackfang Pass fragments marked choke points where Vorthain's fortresses had blind spots. This wasn't arbitration, it was strategy disguised as divination. Dr. Vex's most chilling discovery lay in the marrow. Microscopic analysis showed traces of iron gall ink deep within the bone's pores, the same ink used in royal decrees. Someone had been annotating the map in secret, adding names and dates long after the bones were carved. Worse, some inscriptions matched handwriting samples from known court scribes. The conspiracy thickened. Had the Arbiters been puppets, their verdicts subtly guided by unseen hands? Or were they the puppeteers, playing kings against each other to force a peace only the dead could broker? Historians sparred over the findings. Traditionalists dismissed them as overreach. Bones weather, ink fades, and academic sea patterns in tea leaves, scoffed one tenured professor. But revisionists pointed to a neglected passage in the annals of Serindor, where a disgraced chancellor raged about monks who take dictation from crypts. Even the timing raised questions. The last known arbiter died mysteriously weeks before the accord was signed. Their final journal entry a single sentence: "They know we cheated." The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the lines, or in this case, beneath them. The bone map's power wasn't just in its macabre medium, but in its perfect ambiguity. It gave war-weary kingdoms an excuse to stop fighting without conceding defeat, a divine intervention they could blame instead of each other. Whether the Arbiters were saints, schemers, or something in between, their legacy endures in the quiet certainty that borders aren't just drawn. They're earned, paid for in a currency no living hand can mint, and sometimes it takes the dead to remind us what that price truly was. The more you examine the bone map's borders, the more a chilling pattern emerges, one that doesn't quite line up with divine impartiality. Serindor didn't just gain territory, they gained leverage. The Isle of Thorns, dismissed by rivals as a worthless rock, controlled the only deep-water approach to Almaria's southern coast, a fact Serindor's admirals exploited within months of the accord. Vorthain's loss of the Golden Bowl stripped them of grain reserves, forcing dependence on Serindor's suddenly bustling ports and those bone-marked trade routes. They funneled tariffs straight into Serindorian coffers. Coincidence? A growing faction of scholars thinks not. Dr. Cale Riven's controversial thesis points to the runes themselves. Using spectral analysis, he identified subtle variations in carving techniques, Andorian coastal dialects creeping into inscriptions near key territories. Even the bone placements raise eyebrows. In the Blackfang Pass, where Vorthain's fortresses were strongest, the skeletal borders zigzag inexplicably, creating indefensible gaps. Yet dig a little deeper and you'll find those gaps align perfectly with Serindor's ancient smuggling tunnels, long thought abandoned. The dead don't need supply lines, Riven notes dryly. But living conquerors do. Then there's the matter of the Arbiters vanishing. Records show their monastery's last abbot, a man named Elias, was born in a Serindorian fishing village. And not just any village, but the one that later became the Accord's primary naval base. When pressed, modern monks admit their archives contain a curious gap. Every document from Elias's reign was sealed with a unique wax imprint showing a ship's prow, not the traditional crossed bones. The implication, the Order's final years might have been less about sacred duty and more about serving a very earthly master. But here's where it gets truly Machiavellian. Carbon dating reveals that many ancient bones near Serindor's Gains are newer than those in other regions, some by centuries. One rib fragment from the Isle of Thorns bears tool marks matching a Serindorian shipwright's adze, a tool not invented until decades after the Arbiters supposedly vanished. Either the dead updated their own map, or someone was carefully curating which bones got unearthed and when. Of course, the counterarguments have merit. Proponents of the map's authenticity point to its psychological brilliance. No forger could have predicted how deeply medieval minds would fear the dead's judgment. And if Serindor benefited most, wasn't that simply because their ancestors had sacrificed more? As historian Lyra Velm puts it, the bones don't lie, but liars might have moved them. The truth likely lies somewhere in the marrow, a mix of genuine belief and ruthless pragmatism, where faith and strategy bled together until even the players couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. What's undeniable is the outcome. Whether by divine will or political chess, the bone map didn't just redistribute land, it reshaped power dynamics for generations. Serindor's golden age of influence began the moment the Accord was signed, their ships gliding through waters the dead had seemingly granted them, and that, perhaps, is the most telling detail of all. Because in the end, it doesn't matter if the Arbiters were saints or spies. What matters is that their map worked and that every ruler who bowed to it had to wonder, right up to their dying breath, whether they'd been outplayed by corpses or kings. The bone map's eerie legacy lingers in today's world, where borders are still drawn in blood and memory. Think of the trenches of World War I, where soldiers' bones still surface a century later, or the mass graves along modern conflict zones, their unmarked outlines echoing the Arbiter's grim cartography. The question isn't just academic. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, archaeologists noted how quickly both sides invoked medieval land deeds and burial sites to justify their claims. History, it seems, is still a weapon, and the dead remain potent political tools. Yet the map's real lesson isn't about the past, it's about the stories we choose to amplify. In Israel and Palestine, olive groves uprooted for settlements often reveal ancient cisterns or pottery shards, each layer of soil whispering older ownership. Both sides wield archaeology like a scalpel, slicing through time to prove who was here first. But what if, like the Arbiters, we measured land not by who arrived earliest, but by who bled most recently? The bone map's genius was its brutal neutrality. It didn't care about royal pedigrees or divine mandates, only the raw arithmetic of sacrifice. Consider the Korean demilitarized zone, a scar across the peninsula where nature has reclaimed no man's land. Ecologists call it an accidental paradise, thriving precisely because humans abandoned it. Local legends say the spirits of fallen soldiers still patrol the fence lines, their presence so palpable that even birds avoid nesting near old guard posts. It's not hard to imagine the Arbiters nodding in approval. Here, the land itself enforces the truce, its boundaries drawn not by diplomats but by decades of minds and memories. Could a modern bone map ever broker peace? The idea seems grotesque until you examine alternatives. The Hague's international courts rely on dusty treaties and satellite images, while warlords manipulate census data to redraw ethnic lines. In contrast, the bone map's power came from its visceral honesty. When Syrian refugees bury loved ones in makeshift camps, those graves become unspoken land claims, ones no document can erase. Social media already crowdsources conflict zones with hashtags and geotags. What if we mapped not just checkpoints, but the personal coordinates of grief? The challenge isn't finding symbols potent enough to halt violence, it's deciding whose pain counts. The Arbiter's privileged battlefield dead, but today's conflicts claim more civilians than soldiers. Imagine a map woven from the shoelaces of executed journalists, the prosthetics of bomb survivors, the school bags left behind in mass shootings. It wouldn't just record borders, it would force us to see who pays for them. Perhaps the bone map's true successor isn't a physical object, but a shift in perspective. In Bosnia, activists have begun projecting the names of Srebrenica's victims onto government buildings at night, ensuring no politician can ignore the weight of their decisions. In Colombia, ex-guerrillas and soldiers jointly excavate mass graves, their shovels unearthing shared losses. These aren't medieval solutions, they're something more profound. The Arbiters taught us that land isn't just soil and resources, it's a living archive of choices. The real question isn't whether we could stomach a bone map today, but whether we can afford to keep pretending borders exist outside of history and the bones beneath them. The bone map's true power wasn't in its bones, it was in the story they told. Think about it. 3 kingdoms had spent generations hacking at each other over the same patches of dirt, every battle just adding more bodies to the pile. Logic hadn't stopped them, guilt hadn't stopped them, but the moment those bones were laid out like some macabre puzzle, something shifted. Because suddenly, the conflict wasn't just about land or pride, it was about legacy. The map gave people a narrative so visceral, so undeniable, that even the most stubborn warlords hesitated. Here's the genius of it. The Arbiters understood that humans don't change because of facts. We change because of stories that rearrange how we see ourselves. By framing the borders as something the dead had decided, they transformed compromise from weakness into reverence. A Vorthain general who'd sooner die than surrender to Almarian dogs might still kneel before his grandfather's rib cage, suddenly seeing his defiance as disrespect rather than honor. That's the alchemy of powerful narratives. They recast the actors without rewriting the play. Modern peace processes could learn from this. Look at South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. It wasn't just about listing crimes, it was about victims telling their stories in rooms where former oppressors had to sit and listen. Like the bone map, it made the invisible visible. The pain wasn't abstract anymore, it had a face, a voice, a rhythm of sobs between sentences. And just as the Arbiters used skeletons to force kings to confront consequences, those testimonies forced a nation to stare into its own reflection. But here's the catch, the story must be believed to work. The bone map nearly failed when skeptics like Baron Edrick called it a fraud. What saved it? The rumors that spread faster than truth, the crops that wilted when borders were crossed, the nightmares plaguing those who mocked the bones. Whether by chance or design, the world seemed to conspire to make the story feel real. Today's equivalent might be social media. Imagine if every time someone violated a ceasefire, their feeds flooded with augmented reality ghosts of that location's war dead. Not as propaganda, but as inescapable context, the most haunting lesson: the map worked best when people stopped seeing it as a tool and started seeing it as a truth. That transition from skepticism to uneasy acceptance is where real change lies. When Serindorian fishermen began hanging bone fragments from their nets as talismans, they weren't obeying kings. They were honoring something deeper, the idea that the land itself kept score, and that some debts couldn't be paid with fresh blood. That's the sweet spot where stories transcend politics and tap into myth, not as lies, but as older, heavier truths wearing narrative clothes. So the next time you see leaders squabbling over borders, ask yourself, what's the bone map here? Not the literal skeletons, though history assures us they're waiting beneath the rhetoric, but the story powerful enough to make both sides lower their weapons without losing face. Because peace isn't just about ending fights, it's about giving people a story they'd rather live inside than die defending. The bone map's borders still etch themselves across the landscape of history, not as faded ink but as scars that never quite heal. Walk the Lysian Valley today, and you'll find farmers plowing around moss-covered boundary stones, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of fingertips tracing the same runes the Arbiters carved. These aren't just markers, they're tombstones for grudges that finally exhausted themselves. What's remarkable isn't that the map ended wars, but how it transformed the very language of conflict. Generations who once spat the names of rival kingdoms like curses now speak them with the uneasy reverence of men passing a graveyard at dusk. The true testament to its power lies in what didn't happen. No statues were raised to the Arbiters, no grand holidays declared in their honor. Their victory was quieter, a collective decision to stop digging mass graves. In Vorthain's royal archives, a single line in a steward's ledger from the year after the accord tells the whole story. Paid 3 silver pennies to relocate the gallows from the contested field, as the crows there grew too bold. No fanfare, just the mundane paperwork of peace. Yet the map's legacy isn't confined to history books. Modern conflict mediators still study its principles, not for its macabre medium, but for its psychological brilliance. When warring factions in a recent desert dispute hit an impasse, negotiators scattered soil from mass graves across the bargaining table. It wasn't theater, it was a mirror, forcing each side to see their own reflections in the dust of the dead. Like the Arbiters, they understood that the quickest way to disarm a quarrel isn't with logic, but with the weight of unanswerable questions. How many more bones will it take? When does the price exceed the prize? What makes the bone map timeless isn't its supernatural aura, but its brutal honesty about human nature. We'll argue over lines in the sand, but hesitate when those lines are drawn in marrow. A diplomat once told me that the hardest negotiations aren't about land or resources, but about memory, who gets to control the story of suffering. The Arbiters weaponized that truth, turning grief itself into a boundary no one dared cross. So the next time you see protesters clashing over a border wall or politicians thumping their chests over sacred soil, listen for the silence beneath the noise. Somewhere underfoot, the bones are waiting not to take sides, but to ask the only question that ever really matters. Is this worth dying for again? If you've ever stood at the edge of a disputed place and felt the hair rise on your neck, you already know the answer. The past isn't finished with us, it's just biding its time. Now it's your turn. What modern conflict could use a bone map's grim clarity? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep unraveling history's thorniest lessons together. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Who knows what other forgotten secrets we'll unearth next time?